thank you all for joining today. And I think, Jessie, it's all yours. Feel free to get started.
Great. Okay, so before I jump too far into the presentation, I do want to give a little preface of, I'm not going to go super deep dives into vanilla Vue or Vuex. This is kind of just on Nuxt and what Nuxt brings to the table that's not in the renderer and the data store itself. That being said, I promise you, if you haven't worked with Vue much, use a very simple language to pick up, and there's nothing crazy in there that you wouldn't have seen if you've worked with like an Angular or React. So if you have any sort of background working with any of those frameworks, this should be easy enough for you to follow along with. Right. Again, for those who joined late, I'm Jessie. I'm a senior engineer at Actual. And before we start talking about Nuxt itself, let's talk about why you might be interested in server-side rendering. Because the reality is, at this point, when it comes to working with Vue, if you don't need server-side rendering, there's not a whole lot of advantage to working with Nuxt. Most of the things that it used to bring to the table before are things that now Vue CLI handles. So when it first came out, it was one of the easiest ways to get static generated sites. Now just about all the ways you can work with Vue, you can generate those. So really the advantage is going to be SSR. So let's talk about what some of the advantages of SSR are going to be. So one of the main advantages for SSR is going to be that, at least from a pure user perception, the application is going to be perceived as faster, and that's because your page is going to be rendered quicker. Now, the actual speed of your page may not ultimately be affected because you may still be waiting on some additional data calls and other things to be loaded before your page is able to be interacted with, but just the visuals are going to convince your users that your page is going to run a little bit faster. Another advantage is if you can do more of your rendering on the back end as opposed to making those later data calls to get more information, you're going to make less, could be costly calls for users with limited bandwidth. Because if you think about you're making an AJAX call, every single time you're sending headers, which could be multiple cookies, all of that, and that can have a pretty significant impact on users who have data caps. Another advantage is going to be the less that you're worried about client-side JavaScript, the less the potential there's going to be for the browser's implementation of JavaScript to prevent your application from working. Obviously, that's a little bit less of a concern with the modern browser landscape. Most browsers render things pretty evenly across the board at this point, but there are still some weirdness between, like a Safari and Firefox like Firefox tends to handle everything to spec, but we still have some like latencies with some of the OEM browsers. And then the last thing that you're really going to get out of this is going to be improved SEO. And I will say there's a bit of a caveat to this as well, in that it used to be even a few years ago that Google and other web crawlers wouldn't necessarily wait for your page to finish rendering when it did the scraping. Nowadays, the estimate that most people have is that Google will wait about 10 seconds to see what's going to be there at the end of it. But what can be an issue is Google's going to wait for certain page events to occur when it is doing that, because it does try to get through your site as quickly as possible. But some of the custom events that frameworks throw, Google doesn't detect. If you're working with something a little bit more mature, probably a little bit less of an issue because they've written some stuff to account for that. Especially if you're going to be working with a newer framework, you can run into the issue where you find Google's not recognizing your entire site. And kind of how you can test that and see if that is an issue for your site. If it is a domain that you own, you can use Google Search Console. And inside of the Search Console, If you go into the mobile inspection and click on screenshot, you can actually see how Google's crawler sees your site. So I have run into instances working on some previous websites where we'll see things like, oh, Google doesn't know where navigation is, or it didn't load this piece of content. So those are things that you might want to look into if you're noticing that maybe your pages aren't being indexed as high as you think they should be. Granted, with anything, there's going to be some disadvantages as well. So the time to first byte is going to be increased because your server is doing more of the work, and that initial payload to the client is going to be larger than just sending an empty shell of a web page that's going to be loaded later. You'll need less server resources if you're not doing SSR because you're offloading all that work to individual users' browsers. And then not all frameworks are going to play well with SSR. So if you are using a framework where someone hasn't built server-side rendering on top of it and your organization's already using that, you're probably not going to see a real gain here if you're looking at, to get SSR, we need to redevelop our entire website. Okay, so what is Nuxt? So Nuxt is a progressive Vue framework. It is a highly opinionated framework as well, which can be nice in that if you are using this at a place that has multiple developers, it kind of forces you to all go down the same path. The disadvantage of that is if you want to break outside of the box that Nuxt puts you in, it kind of gets funky. And then Nuxt itself is modular and highly configurable, so it can work for multiple use cases. So when you're creating a Nuxt app, the easiest way is to use npx and run the create Nuxt app script. And it's the wizard's going to ask you for a couple of things. So some of this should be things you're familiar with, so like project name, description, author name. One of the things it's going to ask you about is, do you want to use npm or yarn? It'll ask you about UI frameworks. So there's a handful of popular CSS frameworks that have been had libraries built on top of them to integrate them with Vue. So your Bootstrap, Bomas, AntUI, all of those sort of things. Those are kind of options you have. The next one it's going to ask you about is server frameworks. So having a server framework is 100% optional when working with Nuxt. If your end goal of this is either to have it backed by an API that's written in another language, or if you just simply don't want to write a site that's going to have an API behind it, you can choose not to use one. However, this will give you some Bootstrap code for some of the more popular Node frameworks. So I believe some of the options you're going to have are going to be like Express, Koa, Happy, and I think a handful of others. It will ask you for module support. The main ones being at this point Axios and whether or not you want to support progressive web apps. Ask you for your linting tools of choice, testing frameworks. The one that's going to be interesting for us is going to be the rendering mode. So you can either choose to render your application as a single page app, which means that everything's going to execute on the client, or you can do it in Universal. And Universal works a little bit differently depending on whether or not this is going to be backed by a server. So Universal, if you do have a server running, some of it's going to run on the server, some of it's going to run on client side, but the way you write your code is seamless and you don't really have to care about those finer details unless you are very concerned about the server-side rendering part. And we'll get into how you can make sure that your code's executing where you want it to execute if you do have those specific concerns. So part of Nuxt being opinionated is that it gives you a very strict folder structure. So if you're used to working with Vue, and some of your things, you may just have a generic components folder, and that has a mixture of components that are full-on page-level components versus these are small pieces on my page. When it comes to Vue, it forces you to separate those. So it does make all of your uncompiled assets go into a, yeah, the sites will be available afterwards. Assets are going to be anything that's, you don't need to run through any sort of compiler. In this case, it comes shipped with Webpack, so anything you wouldn't want to put through Webpack. Components are going to be the smaller details on the page. Layouts are going to be like full page layouts. It kind of creates them by default, but layouts aren't something that you have to use within your Nuxt app. Middleware is interesting because this allows you to define custom functions that are going to be run before rendering a page. So if you know that you need to make a data call before you run every single page, and this could be for things like authentication, if you want to do something with like Google Analytics and track your page hits, things like that, that you know you want to run every single time someone navigates to your page and you don't really care about how they're interacting with the page, Middleware is a pretty good place to put it. It's also a place where you can put interact with the Vuex store to grab data ahead of time in order to render that on your page. Pages itself, anything inside of there, Vue's going to create a route for. And we'll get into, in the next section, how Vue does automatic routing. Plugins are like little things that you want to run globally throughout your application. So if you work with I18N or any of those things for translations or Google Analytics, there's a plugin for as well to do the client-side event tracking. Those sorts of things you'll put into plugins. The server directory is only going to get generated if you choose a server framework. Static is going to be the root directory, so this is going to be working with like favicon and anything else that you don't need to worry about editing. And then store is also optional. Nuxt comes bundled with Vuex from the start, but you aren't required to use the Vuex store if you don't have a need for it. Right, so let's get into routing. So the way Nuxt works, and you do have the option to configure this in your Nuxt configuration if you want to call the folder something different for some reason, but it's going to look in general for a folder called pages, and anything inside of that, it's going to attempt to create a route for. So if we look at this folder structure where there's a user folder, there's an index.vue and a one.vue, and then an index.vue directly under pages. That means we're going to have an index page under our slash route. We'll have an index page directly under slash user. And then we also will have addition one that's going to be slash user slash one. So it assumes that anything in here is a page that it needs to just create a route for. But you also have the option to create dynamic routes. So if you know that you do pages that are like slash user ID to display a certain user's information, you can do that using slugs. And the way Vue knows that you're trying to use a slug is having the underscore in the beginning of the name. So if it's underscore something.vue, then it knows that on a page level, these are slugs. But you can also have slugs at a directory level. So if you wanted, in this case, wanted to have multiple book reviews and the book name would be within your URL path, you can do it that way. When you are working with dynamic routes, you do have to do a little bit more setup if you're going to do static generation at the end of this. So Vue, when you're doing, or Nuxt, when you're doing the static generation, will automatically create a page in the final compiled version for anything that isn't a slug, but you have to tell it what to fill in for the slugs for anything that's dynamic. So this isn't going to necessarily be a super useful thing if you are working with a web server with pages that change constantly, or in the case of like a user where you're adding users all the time. you're probably going to want to avoid the static generation just because you would have to rerun this every time there's new data in your system. But it is pretty useful for things like blogs or other applications where the data maybe doesn't change super often, or if the data does change, like in the case of a blog, like this can just be part of your flow of like writing that article, because you're more in control of when that data does change. And the nice thing about this is if you do want to base this off of an API, you can actually have, instead of passing in an object in your Nuxt config, you can have this be a function that returns a promise. So that way you can get that data asynchronously when you are building your application. Okay. So the other thing that Nuxt kind of brings to the table is middleware. So middleware is the custom functions that you can that are going to run before you render your page. And you can either do this at a global level, you can do this for a group of pages, or you can do this for a singular page. The middleware function receives a context object as an argument, and the context object has quite a bit of things in it, and I'll go over that in just a second. But each middleware function, when you're writing it out, is going to be its own file in your middleware folder. And that's the way that Nuxt knows that I should use this particular, or behind the scenes, that's how it imports it, so that I can use those functions. So if you're using your Nuxt config just in your router, if you want it to be global, you'll just, in your router key, you'll give it the middleware stats. And middleware can also be an array if you want to give it multiple things that it should be running. If you're doing one for a specific page, you have two options. You still have the option of creating a file in your middleware folder, especially if you do want to use it for a couple of pages. But the other option you have, if it's definitely only going to be used for a singular page, is you can write a function, which makes it just an anonymous piece of middleware that you're not going to be able to use elsewhere. But kind of the same way, when you're defining your app, just in your export default, in your individual page, you'll just do middleware and pass it which one you want. And again, this does take an array of middleware if you do need multiple. And as far as how you write a middleware, you can do asynchronous functions inside of this. You can interact with your store. Really anything that you would normally be able to do post-page load, you're able to do pre-page load with middleware. And this is guaranteed to run before anything is rendered, which is good to keep in mind if you're really concerned about things showing up. And then, so we have the context object. The context object is going to be used in a couple different places throughout your application. It's going to be passed to your plugins, passed to middleware, as well as some custom event functions that Nuxt adds on top of Vue. So your context object has quite a few keys. So some of them are only going to be available for server-side rendering. Some of them are only going to be available on the client side. But some of them you're going to be able to use in both. So you have access to your app. So that's going to be your whole Vue instance. You'll have access to the store, routes, any params off of, or queries off of your route, env, which are going to be all your environment variables that were set in your Nuxt config. And then isDev, which lets you know, are you running this in dev mode or in production mode. Another key you get is HMR, which you should only be getting when you're running inside of dev mode. You can check, you have a redirect if you want to do custom logic. So let's say that if a user's unauthenticated, you want to redirect them to the login page, you can do that with your redirect. But then you also have error where you can pass it a status code if there's any sort of logic you want to run that's beforehand. And then if you're working with the server, you do get the request and response object that you would normally get for Node. And then you also get a method to update the Nuxt variable on the client side with before Nuxt render. And then from the client side, you have both from and Nuxt state. So anything that you did with before Nuxt render, you'll be able to use later on in this Nuxt state. So if you are going to use these keys from your contacts, you do have to have a little bit of logic around it. So if you're going to use any of the client or server-side specific keys, or this is also an option if you want to force certain things to run on one side versus the other, you can do these either if process.server or if process.client to force things to run where you want them to run. And then Nuxt also introduces some new Vue hooks. The one that's going to be really interesting to you as far as server-side rendering, especially for a static generated site, is going to be async data. So this runs before the page component is loaded, and this populates your data for the page. You also have fetch, which runs the first time it'll run before the page is rendered on the server. But if you re-navigate back to this page at another point, it won't run fetch again. So that is something to keep in mind of if you expect the data to change between user navigation, fetch isn't going to be a great place to put it because it will have stale data between navigation. In this, you can put data into your Vuex store. And the last thing that Vue gives you, or Nuxt gives you, is head, which allows you to set HTML head tags for the current page. And then this method is also going to be available for you inside of the layout components. But all of these are only going to be available under page level components. If you have your more widgety components, these will not be available to you. I'm going to go and get into some code to kind of go into deeper examples, but before I do that, let me see if there's any questions I can answer. Here's a couple of type opening.
So far, I don't see any questions, Jessie.
Okay. All right, I can go ahead and pop into some code. So there's a few things I want to show you guys. First, in particular, is going to be our Nuxt config. So inside of here, we have universal mode, and this is what's going to enforce our server-side rendering. All of the header tags are going to be defined in the object here. Some of this is just kind of more stylistic. You can define, so some of this could be kind of similar to your Vue config if you've seen those before with Vue CLI. So let you define some build modules. In this case, I just have ESLint. And my UI framework, here we have a middleware defined. And if I open up my middleware function called sessions, this is just calling an API call and then talking to our store. If I go into the store, we can see with set sessions, it's just an array. And in the case of the application that I'm running, this is how I'm building out the navigation to make sure that that's rendering on every single page. And then the one that's really important is going to be generate. Since anytime that you are using those slugs, you're going to want something like this. So if I go to my page, we see we have session and then a slug for each individual page for the sessions. So I'm just going to make an API call and return a list of every page that Nuxt needs to dynamically generate. This can be as simple or as complicated as you need to be. You don't have to do an API call. If you know that's a statically generated list, you could theoretically hard code it. If it's based off of things like maybe you're building a blog off of Markdown files, you can just write something that looks into your file system and creates a page for every single article in that folder that contains your markdown. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And when you're running Nuxt, you get a couple of options. So Dev is really for, as it sounds, for your development. This will do hot reloading of your website, so if you make any changes, you'll automatically see those reflected in your browser. Nuxt build is going to be for if you want to do, I believe, I'm now blanking. It's either build or generate, which gives you the statically generated pages. And then start's going to be your production mode. Oh, I'm sorry, that's right. So you run build before you run your production one to kind of pre-generate some assets. So that's going to be for things like if you're running things through like Babel to make it compatible with the browsers, if you're doing compression of images, compiling your CSS, things like that. But then Nuxt generates, essentially runs build but creates your statically generated sites if you want to run we're in a case where you're not going to be backed by a server. And then up here, you still have options to use computed like you would normally use with inside of your Vue app. And in this case, I have using both async data and fetch. I'm going to go ahead and generate this, and we're going to take a quick look at the HTML because I want you guys to see how this looks when you're doing those static generated sites. So we're going to see that how speakers are handled. It's going to look a little bit different than how the sessions do. I realize this is going to be kind of a pain, but I will be honest, this was an example site, so we did not optimize. But we can see here that we have in our script, in this case, in the script for the page, it will have all of our data. But if we look up here, we have information about the session, but the information about the speaker is missing. But if we were to go to the site itself, the speaker information is there, and that's because it's being rendered after the fact. So it's taking it from the JavaScript that it has on the page and putting it into the DOM afterwards. If your number one concern is SEO, this is potentially not a big deal. Google will probably wait for this, but it is something to keep in mind, especially if it's a ton of data that you know that this is going to kind of have to churn through a bit. And then, yeah, the only other thing I'll say is that in this particular case, because it was sample code, I am using a server, but if you are looking to do the static generation, the best practice from Nuxt is not to use the server and just use Nuxt without a node server behind it. And that's pretty much Nuxt as a whole. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks, Jessie. So can you go further about how Nuxt manages routing?
Sure. So Nuxt manages routing. Let me go ahead and share my screen again. So Nuxt handles routing for you. So what it looks for is a folder called pages. And any folder underside of under pages, it's going to create a top-level directory for, and anything with .vue in it, it's going to create a page for. If it's a slug, so something that starts with an underscore, if you're working with a server, it'll automatically handle that for you because it assumes that there's some sort of data it can retrieve. But if you're doing static generation, you do have to go into your Nuxt config and give it either a routes object that has all of the routes that dynamic routes that you're gonna have for it, or give it a function that's gonna return a list of those dynamic routes. So like in this case, it's automatically gonna give me an index page, but I'm gonna have to tell it each page I want under sessions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So how does the config handle different HTTP verbs, or I'm sorry, methods? So I see that like the get method is there. It's like, say that you have put or patch or delete. How complicated does the configuration have to get, or can you get that for free with your folder structures?
So the answer to that is that Nuxt isn't going to handle any verb besides get. So Nuxt isn't going to be used for your APIs. This is just for delivering pages.
Okay.
You can put a server behind it, so you could use Koa or Happy or Express. And if you use a server, then it's going to give you some boilerplate code to render the pages and call Nuxt behind the scenes for you. And then you would just write it like a normal node server with whatever framework you're using to handle any API requests on top of the pages.
Any other questions? Cool. So I don't see any other questions coming up, Jessie. Thank you for doing the talk today.